Hi, welcome back to Watercolours with Caroline. This is week 4 of our Zoom lessons, and this week we're going to be painting a picture of Loch Tay in Scotland in a wide format. Hopefully you've got a piece of paper that's about mine's 5 by 10, so something that's nice and wide. This is based on some watercolours by Ronald Maddox, a now deceased artist from the UK, who painted a beautiful series of watercolours for the British Post Office around 1980, and I saved all of my letters I got from the UK on aerograms because they're so beautiful. And so I want to acknowledge that we are copying his painting, so we have to be very careful we don't sell this or post it or do anything like that without accrediting that we have copied this artist. But it's a great way to learn how to paint in a loose and free and sort of stylized manner. So let's get our paints ready and our piece of paper, and we'll get going. Making a great chart of greens. So we'll use the colors in your palette, going from your lightest yellow to your darkest yellow and your lightest blue to some of your darker greens. And we're going to put a little mixture in each one. So let's start with lemon yellow. Get my palette over here and get my lemon yellow. And I'm going to mix that with my cerulean blue. We don't need to make much. We're just making a little tiny square. So just make a very small amount, enough you can see the color. Mix it till you get a lovely green and pop that in your square. So that's lemon yellow and cerulean blue, and it makes a surprisingly beautiful green. That's why I love doing this, because I forget what beautiful colors sometimes that you can make. Now we're going to go all across here with the lemon yellow and changing up, doing it with different blues. So another bit of yellow here. And now we're going to the cobalt blue. Now cerulean is a cool blue. It's actually helpful. It's helpful if you put a little bit of color just beside the one that you're mixing, just so you kind of have a reference. Now the next one, cobalt blue. Put a little reference here. It's a warm blue. It will make a slightly different green. And just add enough that you get a pretty green there. Of course, you can add more or less. And pop that in there. And you'll see immediately that the cerulean blue makes a very bright, cool green. And when you add the cobalt blue, you get a much duller, warm green, because the blues are different. And of course, depending on what you want, you will mix something different depending on what you want for your composition. Next one's our friend Ultramarine Blue, another very warm blue. So I'm going to clean my palette each time, so I've got a little clean spot. Start with the yellow, because I forget this all the time. You don't want to contaminate your yellow with your blue paint. I've already done a bit of contamination here. Now, depending on how much blue you add, you'll get a different green. So my ultramarine blue is going to give me a slightly darker green than the cobalt, because the cobalt is more gentle. Now there's very few warm blues. Cobalt and ultramarine are my only two warm blues. So now we're going to go to phthalo, which is a extremely cool blue. There we go. It should make an extremely crisp, cool green. So start with the yellow to keep it clean. And then I'm going to have to get a little tiny bit of phthalo blue because it's very strong, and see what that makes. Make a lovely bright green. Prussian blue, quite a bit darker, but still a cool blue. Very, very, very pretty blue and lovely for making forest greens. So let's start with the lemon again and some Prussian. Ooh, that's going to be quite pretty. and pop that in. You won't see a lot of difference until they dry. Sometimes you'll see that some will dry much more dull than others. Next one is permanent green, light. No, just permanent green. This is an M gray, new M Graham one that I bought because it's so pretty. I saw it on a YouTube video, and I thought I want to try that color. It is a bit opaque though. I'm going to start with my lemon yellow, add my permanent green, and it's going to make lemon's quite opaque and permanent green's quite opaque. So it's going to make quite an opaque color, but you can fix that by adding a lot of water to it. And it makes a beautiful, beautiful, bright green, summer grass. Sap green, I only like Daniel Smith sap green. Most of the other sap greens are not that pretty, but Daniel Green's one is gorgeous. So that's the one I buy. And the lemon again. Now, of course, you can use sap green on its own, no problem. But it's also beautiful mixed with blue or with yellow. Get a little bit more lemon and mix that. The yellows just lighten it up enough to make it more springy. If you wanted to have two types of green on a tree, one with some yellow, one with just sap green. Now, green gold this is my core green gold. It's a very browny gold. I'm going to see, I don't even know if I've ever mixed it with lemon. So let's see what that's going to look like. Ooh, kind of like I'm trying to think of the color, like almost a khaki sort of color. Oops, I've lost my brush. On that brush. Now, phthalo green, we're getting into my greens now. It's a very, very cool, strong green. Not good to use by itself ever for greenery like trees and stuff. It's too strong. But when you mix it with anything else, phthalo green will give you some stunning colors. Just mix it with a bit of lemon. And that gives you something very close to that permanent green. In fact, it gives you a color close to a lot of tube permanent greens. And the one I forgot when I was putting them down, I forgot that I have some cobalt teal, which is an extremely cool blue and should make quite a pretty green as well. So there we go. So here with just your lemon yellow, you've got a big range of greens. Now you can change those greens up by adding water. Like I'm just going to add a little bit of water to that one I just did, or you can change them up by adding more blue or more yellow. So it's a huge amount of changes that you can do for each one of those. Those are just your base colors. Now I use Azo Yellow, but you may use cadmium yellow or permanent yellow. I put permanent yellow down here too, but I don't have it right upstairs here. So this is my Azo Yellow. I like it because it's very transparent and it mixes with everything so beautifully. So let's try it with cerulean blue. Too much blue. Sometimes if you add too much at the start, you just have to go back and add a bit more yellow. I've made way too much paint here. Made enough for our whole painting that we're going to do. So it's quite similar to the other one. Now, lemon yellow and Azo Yellow are going to be very similar, except the Azo will be more translucent. Next one is with Cobalt Blue. I'm getting a bit carried away and using too much paint. I've got to stop using so much. Yeah, Cobalt Blue. And the reason I prefer Azo to lemon is because I usually get a more transparent look. Ultramarine. Too much blue. I'm getting much too slapdash. I'm trying to put too much paint down here as if I'm mixing for painting. I've got to calm down. And phthalo blue. Ooh, that's pretty. Little bit, Caroline. Prussian blue. Of course, there's you might have other blues in your palette that you want to try, and you might have other yellows that you want to try. Permanent green. And sap green.
Did you say the permanent green was M. Graham?
Yes, I saw I'm trying to think of his name, one of the artists that I follow on YouTube. I saw him do a whole painting using M. Graham's permanent green, and I had to go out and buy one because his painting looked so amazing. But he uses M. Graham most of the time, and I don't buy many greens because I find that you can mix all of these pretty much with with one or two yellows and one or two blues. You can have a huge variety here, so I don't bother buying them. But I did really love that permanent green from M. Graham, and M. Graham's paints are they're so transparent and clear and true to color that sometimes it's just lovely to have that bright green right there at your fingertips rather than trying to remember how you mixed it. And I didn't use phthalo green for many years. I used Viridian because I think I was a little bit scared of how bright the phthalo green was. But then when I did one of these charts one day and I found out what gorgeous light greens you could mix with it, I was amazed. And that's when I went out and bought a tube of phthalo green. Also, I found out that Daniel Smith makes their sap green by mixing quinacridone gold, the old proper one. They used to use the old proper I'm just going to do that right now. Sorry, move this over. So they used to mix the proper quinacridone gold with phthalo green to get their sap green. I'm going to put that, where's my phthalo green? Permanent green, phthalo green with quinacridone gold. So look what happens. Let's move that up. When you mix quinacridone gold, and mine's not the original one, it's the newer one, with phthalo green. And that's when I really appreciated what a wonderful color phthalo green is, because it is clear and dark and translucent, and it's just gorgeous. So that is my mixture of quinacridone gold and phthalo green. And this underneath here, this is Daniel Smith's sap green. So I actually think mixing your own is more gorgeous, but the quinacridone gold is such an expensive paint that you don't like to waste it mixing green all the time. So that's why I went out and bought a tube of their sap green. But I didn't realize what a versatile, important color the phthalo green was when you use it for mixing. So the next one, I have permanent yellow here, which is in my other paint box, which is in my travel bag. So I'm not going to do that one today. If you have it, you can pop it in later. I'm going to do Gamboge, my orangey. Again, this is an M. Graham. I tend to most of the time buy M. Graham. They're better value for money, and they're just gorgeous. They're artist quality. They're gorgeous paints, and they're definitely worth buying. So I'm going to get a very different look with the Gamboge because it has quite a sort of a red tone to it. So you're going to get more earthy colors. So that's with the cerulean blue. And then with the cobalt, so with the cobalt, you should be getting a very earthy, because what you're getting now is when you mix orange and blue, like we found, I think it was last week or the week before, when you mix orange and blue, you're going to get these earthy tones, these sort of gray greens. So that's, and Gamboge is pretty orange. And with ultramarine, you should get an earthy tone too. There's nothing wrong with getting earth tones if you want them. Having trouble. There we go. So that's with your ultramarine. If you wanted a beautiful dulled down earth tone green, that's a lovely one. And but of course you can get the same effect by using Azo Yellow with a little touch of red to tone it down too. So it's a question of how much mixing do you want to do? So Phthalo Blue strong, so you're never going to need very much of it. But again, because the Gamboge is orangey, mixed with the Phthalo Blue, you are going to get a duller mix than with the more bright yellows. But that's sometimes what you want if you're doing the darks on a tree, say. And this is using quite a lot of colors here. So I'm doing the Gamboge with the Prussian. Again, very pretty dark green. If you want to darken a green, add the complementary, add a red or a reddy brown or something in the complementary range to bring it down to a more earthy dark color. I've never tried Gamboge with my permanent green because I haven't had my permanent green very long. So let's try it here. Ooh, quite pretty. And with the sap green, I imagine it will make a earthy sort of green with the sap green. Again, quite pretty. Green gold is a very different color. I just came in a box, mixed box, and I don't use it very much because it's not really what you'd call gold and it's not really what you'd call green. Makes a very khaki color with the Gamboge. And what else we got here? Phthalo. There we go. The Phthalo Green and the Cobalt Teal. And the Cobalt Teal is quite opaque and the Gamboge is a little bit opaque. So you're going to get some more opaque-ish sort of colors, which you have to be careful of, because if you do 2 or 3 layers of opaque colors, that's when you get mud on your painting. That's when you get really thick, not very pretty layers. Now, raw sienna is earth color, of course, but it is in your sort of yellow range. So we'll try, and you will get some earthy colors with raw sienna. Let's try it with cerulean blue. And I did notice that Ronald Maddox used some of his earth colors. So you get a real gray, very gray green with those two. Cobalt.
What kind of raw sienna do you suggest?
Brand, you mean?
Yes.
I buy M. Graham raw sienna, and I love it. Winsor and Newton are really good colors, but I find here in Canada, they're made in England, in the UK, I find they're really expensive here. They're worth it. They're right. Good paint, but I just find that the tube of M. Graham paints is a bigger tube, and and really gorgeous colors. So I can't always justify paying the extra money for the Winsor & Newton, which I think are really lovely paints. I did pay more money to get the Winsor & Newton burnt sienna because it's more beautiful than all the others. I've tried all the others, and they're, for me, they're too much like a muddy sort of burnt
Right.
sienna.
I'm
So
not
you
sure
sort of,
what I got for raw sienna, but I don't like it. So
oh,
I do.
which brand do you have, Linda?
I don't know. I'm going to
Oh.
check my little box right now. I haven't liked it for a long time, and I don't use it enough that I go through it. So I'll just check.
I'm just going to paint a bit. I've been forgetting to paint my little bit on the side here. Give me a yeah, I found that Winsor & Newton or M. Graham raw sienna, I've loved all of them. And sometimes you have to, like, I'm just diluting mine a little bit water. Sometimes if you put it on too thick, it's not very nice, but if you dilute it out with water, it's really, really pretty.
It is pretty. It is
Yeah.
pretty.
The other one, of course, in that range is yellow ochre. And I think mine's Winsor & Newton. I just find that yellow ochre is mixed with white, and I just find for me it's too opaque. I prefer my colors to be more transparent, but it's very, very similar to raw sienna. You can use them interchangeably. They're so similar. I just prefer more transparency with the paint. So I go to the raw sienna more than I do with the ultramarine. It makes not a very nice color, actually. It makes a really dull, muddy sort of gray color. It's not a color I would use, I don't think. And that's the thing. Raw sienna is best used either mixed with burnt sienna or on its own. Mixing
I have
it
no
with
idea what kind I've got. 'Cause I must have used. Oh no, I've got it here. Oh, I do have Winsor & Newton. Oh, I don't know.
well, it should be a good one.
Maybe I just.
But then we all have our preferences as to what colors we like and what colors we're not that keen on. So it's
True.
And if you're not that keen on it, try yellow ochre. Like I'm not keen on raw umber at all, or even burnt umber very much. I don't buy them. I don't like them. And that's just a personal thing. Some people use them all the time. And for me, they don't suit what I like to do. So. But that doesn't mean that they're not a valuable color to have. So I'm doing now the raw sienna with the permanent green is making rather a lovely, I can't even think what you'd call that, but it's like a vegetable green. Very, very different to some of the brighter ones, but interesting. I know I'm going through them a little fast. I don't want to take too long with the mixing green chart. And people can do that on their own time too. They want to watch the video back and do some mixing. That's with the sap green. Looks very pretty. With the green gold. I can't have my palette in front of me the whole time. I don't have enough desk space here. And I'm interested what it will look like with the phthalo green. Again, I don't mix the raw sienna with other colors very much. I don't think it's a good mixer. It really muddies up a lot of these colors. Some cobalt teal. So it doesn't produce very nice greens. And you're going to find that the yellow ochre, I won't go through all of these because the yellow ochre is going to produce a very similar effect because it's extremely similar to raw sienna. So I won't go through all of them. You can do those on your own time if you feel like it. Quinacridone gold. And you can't get the pure quinacridone gold anymore. Daniel Smith did buy all the leftover stocks, but I think they may have saved a few back, but they say they've gone through all of them. So now they mix it with 2 other colors, and most brands mix it with 2 other colors that look extremely similar. So I'm going to mix quinacridone gold with cerulean blue. And the thing is, all the quinacridone paints stain. They are intense colors, they stain, and you have to be very, very careful, because if you put them on, you can't usually lift them off. So if you want that lovely bright color, you have to be perfectly sure that you put it on the right strength and you don't want to lift it. But it is extremely pretty up a little bit here. It's a very transparent golden color. And of course, being a quinacridone, it's not going to fade easily. Cobalt blue, we're going to mix it with now. There we go. Again, we're mixing it with the cool blue here, which makes a much prettier green than the warm blue, which makes a much more khaki green. That's why it's so important to know your warm and cool colors. And people say, but red's warm and blue's cool, but there is a range in both. There's a range of cool reds and there's a range of cool blues and cool yellows. If you've got yellows that look like this, you know, they're more acid, more greeny, they're cool. Yellows that are more orangey, they're warm. So it does look rather lovely with the ultramarine though, even though it's a warm blue. Whenever I do this, I don't know why I don't use some of these colors more often for mixing greens, because they do make the most gorgeous greens, especially this quinacridone gold. It's shaping up to be a lovely one. I don't like using it because it's so expensive. With the Prussian blue, ooh. And they're so translucent too. That's really gorgeous with the Prussian blue. Oh, I've never tried it with permanent green. I wonder what's going to happen here. Well, it's more like green gold. It actually, if you just mixed a little bit more quinacridone gold, I'm going to put it underneath, and a little bit more water maybe. I'm just going to put it under here. And right beside it, I'm going to put the green gold. It's always interesting when you find you can mix something that's very close to something that you buy. Now, the green gold is just a tiny bit more yellow, but I could alter that by adding, I've added a little bit of yellow. Oh, no, I've added it to the wrong one. So I think by using permanent green, quinacridone gold, and a little bit of Azo Yellow, there we go. I've got something that is almost the same as green gold, which is really, really interesting. You'd be hard put to tell the difference. Now we know that we know the one with the phthalo green, but let's try it with the sap green, which is Daniel Smith. So it already has the phthalo green in it. So they've already mixed phthalo green in with their quinacridone gold. So it's just a bit more goldy mixed with their sap green. And then the green gold. I think I've mixed green gold and quinacridone gold before. You just get a much more browny color. And lastly, with cobalt teal. Quite a pretty one there. Oh, there we go. So that you can, like I've missed out the yellow ochre one because it's very similar to raw sienna. You can do that in your own time. And I missed out the permanent yellow one because that's downstairs in my travel bag in my other palette. But you can use your own colors, your own yellows and blues and greens to mix yourself a green chart. And it's so useful if you are painting a picture and you think, I want to really bright spring green for the grass in the sunlight. Well, I'm thinking like Azo Yellow and permanent green here, or Azo Yellow with cobalt teal. Really pretty Azo Yellow with cerulean blue makes quite a lovely light green. And even with, where's the phthalo green? If I mixed more yellow with the phthalo green, which I'm going to do right now, to try and get something even brighter. So I'm mixing one that's Azo Yellow with phthalo green, but more yellow to make it nice and bright. And of course, I can also put water with it to make it really, really thin and light, which is important sometimes when you're going to come along and do some darker greens over the top. Really important to water your first layers down, like when we do this painting we're going to do. So let's there. Right, so we're ready to start our painting. We're going to do the cerulean blue sky the way we did it for a couple of other paintings, where we just wet the sky area and put in some cerulean blue, just very gentle, one layer sky. And I don't want to wet the hills because I do want to be able to come and work on the hills later without having to worry about drying them. So I'm going to go very carefully around the edge of them, and the mountains too, because I want to work on the mountains without having to fuss too much with the hairdryer. I've got this is my number 8 brush and some nice clean water. I'm trying to be quite careful how I put that on. And if you have 140-pound paper and it's cotton paper, then you do need to leave it for a few seconds to sort of soak in a little bit. Otherwise, your water's floating on top. But if you have cheaper paper, you may need to go to work straight away because it doesn't stay wet as long as the cotton. Right, I think I just tip it. No, I got dry spots here. It's amazing. A couple of dry spots. Just tip it to see. It should be glistening if it's all wet. There, that looks okay. I'm going to switch to a slightly smaller brush, a 6, and I'll just bring my tray over. So some cerulean blue. Now, when you mix the blue to go on the wet sky, you don't want a lot of water with it. I've taken a wet brush, some cerulean blue, and just put it here. And I don't think I need to add any water to that. Otherwise, I'm going to have too much water on my paper. And I'm going to start in the corner just to see how it's mixing with the water. And of course, remember what I said about corners? You need to make sure that you have some color in the corners. But what you're doing is making sure that I'm going to mix a little bit more water with my cerulean blue at my hills. You need to make sure that you leave some white for some clouds. As you get into the painting, you can leave a bit more white. Now your corner is filled. And remember, your clouds have to be those very random patterns that you can observe in the sky. They're not going to be puffy little perfect things. So I'm going along. I particularly want to get some sky fairly close to most of those mountains. Adding a little bit more water to my blue just because my background water is starting to dry up a little bit. Not too much cloud over here, I don't think. And maybe I'll have it a little light next to the mountain there so I can have the purple against the cloud. And I'm going to use a thirsty brush. I've got a Kleenex here. I'm going to use a thirsty brush to just want to take a little bit of this up. Just take a little bit of blue off here. I feel it's tiny bit too strong. It's really difficult because it looks strong when you put it down. And you kind of think, oh, I don't know, I might want to have it lighter, but it lightens up as it dries. And sometimes a really pretty blue sky is so nice and delicate. But the thing is, don't touch it. Like I know I did a little bit of fussing in the corner here. Don't do it all over. Don't keep fussing with your sky. Don't try and go back and put water in. Don't try and go back and put paint in. Just let it do its thing. Just let it settle in, fuse into the wet background and find its own way. This one is much, much brighter than this one that I did. But then Ronald Maddox's one is a little bit darker. I think he probably used a little bit of cobalt in his sky. Now the lake I want to do on dry paper because I want to skip parts of the lake on the texture of the paper. And I'm going to use that same cerulean blue. You could add in a little bit of phthalo, you could add in a little bit of cobalt just to get some sort of streaks of different color, but working on dry paper. And I'm going to use my number 8 brush. And definitely if you're doing water, you need to go horizontally with your brush strokes back and forth. So I'm going to get a little bit more cerulean blue mixed up here. I also want to get a little bit of cobalt blue mixed up in case I want to add a few warm streaks to the water, and phthalo blue. Over here. So I've got 3 blues that I can be using. I'm going to start back here because I want to start far away from me and with the smaller parts. So I'm going to start with the cerulean blue and just go side to side. I'm not going to bother about the sailboats for the moment because I'm going to come back and do those at the end. Now, what I did just then was I tapped my brush off on my sponge a little bit. So I had just a little bit less paint on my brush because I'm going to zoom in. As I pull my brush across the page, you can see it's a dry brush and it's skipping across the water. I'm going to take a little bit of that cobalt and I want it a little darker next to it. I've got to tap a bit of that paint off on my sponge. A little bit darker over this side on the shadow of this hill. And I've got my Kleenex, I'm taking all the paint off and I'm using my brush with no paint on to just pull that cobalt out into the lake. A little bit more over here, a little bit more just there. I've got a very dry brush. What it looks like Ronald Maddox has done, it looks like he's taken a sharp knife and scraped. Now, some artists do that. They take a sharp knife and they scrape the highlights back when the paint's dry. I don't like to distress the paper that way in case I want to paint over it after I've done all that scraping. And once you've messed the paper up, it's kind of done. So I prefer to just skip with dry brush. Now, one thing I want to do here, I want to do multiple things with this water. I want to have a layer of water just here so I can sort of dissolve the paint into that layer of water so that I don't have a hard edge against there. And I'm putting my, still got cerulean blue, taking my cerulean blue back and forth and skipping. It's still a fairly dry brush. To be careful as I get over here, I actually finish at the edge of the hill. Sorry, I might be shaking the camera a little bit with my hand strokes. I'm going to a little bit now phthalo blue. I have to be careful. Phthalo blue is strong. I want to get my cloth to tap a little bit of it off and add a little bit of phthalo blue to the middle of the lake. And I can see the original painter here has added some water right here to kind of blend this in. So I've done the same. I've dipped my brush in the water, got a little bit of water on my brush, and I'm blending that color in with a little bit of water. So I've got water, dry brush, water, paint. I've got several effects going on here. I put a little bit of water here, move over a little bit. And now I'm going to finish off with some water blooms. I've got quite a bit of water and I want to have some water blooms happening, some loose, a bit of phthalo, a little bit of cerulean, a little bit of loose sort of water bloom look at the edge. And I feel that's a little bit too. Now I know that I'm going to get a run back here and I want that effect. I want to have, actually going to pull out a little bit of that paint. Now, if you look at the original, on the original here, he has really just let his paint go to water at the edge here. He does not have a clear edge. I find that really hard to do. I'm the kind of person that likes to go to a clean edge rather than this sort of an edge, but I'm all for trying new things and trying to make that work for me rather than always have a clean edge. I'm looking over here and I think I want a little bit more paint over here. So I'm going to get the cobalt, mix it with a tiny bit of, I got my cobalt here and I'm going to mix it with a bit of phthalo blue. So I've got a sort of a mix, tap my brush off a bit so I can control my paint and just pull a bit more color in from over here. Now remember, once this is dry and you want to have a bit more color, you can do it. You can do another layer when it's dry. You can pull a bit more paint in, and we might do, pull that back there. I'm pretty sure that some of these darker lines were done after the first layer was dry and just pulled in with a little bit of water on the brush. Oh, the sky, let's see, sky is drying up. Let me just have a look at my notes and see what I did next. So we're going to cerulean blue, phthalo blue, wet and wet. Okay, the hills, light green. Okay, so I've done the light green on the hills next. I think we can definitely do this side. Especially here, because I've used dry brush, we can start putting the light green on the hills. And I have used in my notes, I have used sap green and azo yellow. So let me look at my chart, see what that looked like over here. So that was sap green and azo yellow. So sort of this one. I'm going to water it down so that it's quite light. I'm going to have a really light first layer. I'll bring my palette over, get the azo yellow on first. Now I've got quite a few hills, so this time not making little square swatches. I want to make a bit more paint because I can, even if I make too much paint for the light green, I can just add some dark green to it later to do the dark green layer. So I'm going to add sap green until I get a lovely bright green. A little bit of water because I want it quite light. And I'm going to look at my paint chart. And I'm going to see what else I've got on here that's a pretty green. cerulean blue. I think I want to mix a slightly gentler one with the cerulean blue. So again, I'm going to get the Azo Yellow and a little bit of the cerulean blue. Always use a color you've already used in the painting if you can. It's a really good practice. And there I've got just a more bluey green. So I can use that. What I think I will do is I'll use that more bluey green for the faraway hills over here, and the more yellowy green for the closer hills. I'm going to zoom out a bit so you can see more. I know it's nice to zoom in to see closer, but it's a wide painting. I want to use my bigger brush. I'm going to use my number 10 because I don't want to be doing fiddly, fussy little strokes. And I'm going with that, the first mix I made, the Azo Yellow and the Sap Green. And I want to put it on all these foreground hills with nice, big, bold brush strokes. And I'm trying to go for that look that he has at the edge where I don't take my paint up to the edge. Just because I like that look, I just never seem to achieve it. I might leave that edge a little bit unpainted. Now this looks very bare and samey and all one color. That's okay, because this is our wash that goes underneath all the other greens that we're going to put over the top. It's our base wash. For these hills that are further away, I'm going to switch to a slightly smaller brush. Whoops, my number 8 brush. And I'm going to use that other green I mixed up with the cerulean blue and Azo Yellow. It's very, very bright. You know what? I'm going to add a little bit of cobalt blue to that because I want it to fade into the background just a little bit more. So I added a little bit of cobalt blue to that too. And water, of course. Now, I think why a lot of painters don't add enough water to their paint is they don't think in layers. They put it down and they think that color's not intense enough. It's not covering very well. It's not the color I want. And so they add more paint or more layers, wet in wet. And the thing is, when you're working in layers, you have to start really, really, really light and watered down and work your layers up one on top of the other to get your colors that you want, rather than start too dark. Now I'm getting a little bit of that brighter green, and I am just going to touch that wet in wet here. It's closer to me than back here. And can you see the difference between the one that has a little bit of cobalt added to it and the one that is brighter, that's just the yellow and the sap green? Back here is going to be further away, so I'm going to, and it's smaller, so I'm going to switch to my number 6 brush and the bluer green that has the, have to figure out which ones are hills and which ones are mountains here. This has the cobalt blue. Now behind here are mountains, so I have to be very careful I don't do the wrong ones. Pop that in. And this little one here is green. A big blob of green on that mountain back there. There we go. Pop that in. Now, I don't have extremely clean edges on everything at the moment. That's going to come with the other layers. We don't have to have everything all clean edges at once. And before I put this sort of lilac color in for the mountains, I need to dry this. Otherwise, I'm going to have a little bit of a mess happening. So let me pause. So background mountains, gentle violet. Let's get my other palette over here. And oh, you know what? I want some clean water. I don't want my lilac to have green in it. Yeah. So I'm going to mix for my gentle lilac. I want to mix some permanent rose, a cool red with my warm cobalt blue until I get a lovely gentle violet. This violet will be easy to lift off. It won't stain. If I use the D violet, it's going to be very strong and staining. So it would be maybe a little bit too difficult to use for this stage. Now I've got a very blue violet here, which is what I want, but I also want to have a little bit of a pink violet so I can sometimes add a bit of warmth to the mountain. So I'm going to do the same mix, but with just slightly more rose in it, just so there's just a slight difference between the pinky violet and the bluey violet. It's not massive, but it's just to give a little bit of interest. Now, put this here. And I'm going to have to sort of what's called jigsaw this, which means I'm going to work on a little bit at a time and try and do wet next to dry most of the time, if I can. And they're quite small mountains. I'm going to go to my number 2 brush for a moment. And I think I'll just start over here with I'm going to add even a little bit more cobalt blue at the side, a little bluey violet mountain over here. Just to gauge my color, just to sort of start getting some mountain color on there. I just added a little bit of water to dilute it out a little bit. And we'll put that one over here. I don't want to work next to it at the moment, but there's a mountain here I can work on. So what I'm going to do is add a little bit of water to that mountain. So I've got wet areas, and then I can do some wet and wet. I'm going to the more pinky violet and put that on. And where it hits the water, it's going to sort of dilute a little bit and flow into the water. Now, the way I control that is once I put the violet on and it starts to blend into the water, I just wipe my brush on a sponge rather than the cloth, because the sponge is wet and it sort of doesn't take all of the paint off, but it takes enough off that I can manipulate the paint without putting too much extra paint or water on there. If you put extra water, you'll get a back run, which I did deliberately here because I wanted that kind of back run look. But sometimes you don't want that. You want more control. So I'm taking a little bit of that bluey violet, very small brush, number 2 brush. I'm just poking a little bit of the blue violet in there to wipe my brush on my sponge. And just agitate that in with a wet brush. And I've got a pinky violet mountain with a little bit of blue at the side. And I've got a dry space between them. So I can move over, I'll move over to the other side over here and go to my bluey violet. And I want quite a strong color here. And in the original, this one here is almost white. He does have a bit of a lilac going over it, but we can put that in when it's dry. So we'll leave it white for now and come back with a little bit of light violet when it's dry, just for a tiny shadow. Now there's a real difference between how you paint when you're doing these little control bits to how you paint when you're just getting paint over this whole area for your background color. Very different brush strokes and control. Now I have that one in. Now I need to have some dry space. I can put this one in, but I want to have that blending into wet. So I'm going to wet the bottom of this mountain and then paint from the top down to the water that I've put on there. I don't want to touch that one over here, so I'm just going to come almost up to it. And then use the water that I put on there. Just use that water to pull that paint down. Now what he's done, he's kind of pulled it down in streaks to sort of suggest, I think, snow here maybe. I'm not sure, but I'm thinking that that's what he's suggesting. So I'm going to do the same. I've got a little bit of that blue violet, a little bit of that pink violet, just pulling it down here to maybe suggest snow. And take a little bit of that violet just along the shoreline here. I'm going to zoom in again so you can see a little bit closer what I'm doing. Hope it's moved that under there. Make sure it's focused. I'm going to add a little bit more blue to that, a little bit more cobalt blue. Should tell you which blue for sure. Because as we change up each one, I want to give us a slightly different look to each one, and a look of distance. And again, I've got some clean water on my brush, fairly clean, and I'm going to put some in here. And this is more bluey, this mixture I just made. I can't emphasize enough, I've got a disgustingly dirty looking wet sponge here. It's not dirt on it, it's just paint. But to just tap your brush on a wet sponge rather, is so helpful to controlling your paint and your water, because it doesn't take all of the moisture off of your brush. It just takes enough that you can control your paint and your water. And quite often you'll see a sponge in a paint box. People have asked me, what's that for? It's for this. It's for wiping your brush on to control the amount of paint and the amount of moisture. And I'm going to take a little bit of that rosy, more pinky violet and drop a little bit in, just a tiny bit. So I've got a variegated wash on that mountain. Wash my brush. And again, this little sponge here, so helpful to just wipe my brush on. I also have a cloth if I needed to really, get the paint off and dry it. But the sponge is convenient, just sitting right there usefully. I'm going back over here, and it's fairly dry because I'm working on dry paper, so I can work on this mountain back here. I want it mostly white, so I'm going to wet it. And I'm going to use the blue, very blue violet, and just put that on the tip of the mountain. So we've got a nice edge to it. And just let that blend down into the water I put on there. And we can go back over here. This one we're going to keep fairly white. Have to check on how wet they all are. This one is fairly dry. I'm going to make that. I'm going to use my slightly bigger brush. It's a slightly bigger mountain. I'm going to go to my number 6. And I add a little bit of ultramarine blue just to change up the blue a little bit for this one.
Can I just ask you a question about when you're painting like this, and you've got water in front, and you're going to do a bit of reflection of that color? When do you do that? Do you do it as you paint, or do you do it later?
If I wanted to reflect that in the lake here?
If you wanted those purples to reflect in the lake.
Yeah,
Do it later.
it's totally up to you. Sometimes I find it easiest to do at the same time as doing the mountains, because I have that color on my brush and I have that shape in my brain. So it helps to do that straight away. But sometimes if it's
This
a
is
really,
not- I know this is not quite that. I just wanted to ask.
yeah, no, I welcome all questions and all queries. They're all helpful to everybody. I'm just going to finish up this one because I've got the paint on my brush, and then I will take another little bit of paper and try and answer your question while my other mountains are drying up. So I added a little bit of ultramarine blue to this one to push it even further into the background and just change up. I don't want every single violet in these distant mountains to be the same. I want it to be a little bit different for each one. And that's why I added either a little bit more blue or a little bit more rose, or had a bit more white showing. And I might have to, when they're dry, just come and put a little bit more on to make some stand out. I'll pop that one on. And it's a good opportunity while those are drying to try and answer Judy's question, which has many answers. And really, you can do reflections at any time. So let's say we've got a horizon here. And let's say we have some mountains here. And we've got the lake color. So we have some, say, cerulean blue in our lake, and a bit of cobalt. Now, you can work wet in wet. Now, we could be doing these mountains, and if you wanted a reflection, working wet in wet along this lake shore is not going to be a problem, because you might want to put these mountains reflecting into the lake. So you could put that on wet in wet while you have your lake color there. That would be perfectly acceptable and very pretty use of wet in wet, trying to emulate the shape. So this, you know, if this mountain goes up here, it comes like that down into the water. Now, probably when this layer is dry, you would probably want to put something along that horizon line that's a little bit darker so that it really shows up. But what you can also do is when the lake is dry, let's turn this over. So make a little bit more. Now, what I want you to imagine, that this lake is already painted with blue and is dried, because I don't have time to paint it and dry it. But imagine the lake's painted and dried, and you're putting in your mountains. So this is blue and it's dried. I might get a smaller brush, and you could get that purple color, and you could do like the wiggly reflections that go like this onto a dry lake. So that also looks really lovely as a reflection. So you've got two different ways really of doing it. And if you're doing the wet in wet, you get that lovely soft look. And if you're doing the sort of wiggly lines, you get that harder edge look. We did that with one of the African sunsets. We had a tree, and on the photograph, the tree had those like wiggly lines reflecting from the tree, hard wiggly lines. It just looked perfect. So it kind of depends on what effect you're going for and what you would like to do. I do think that if you do the wet in wet effect, you need to come back when that's dry. Of course, mine's not dry. You need to come back when it's dry and put a little bit more color along the horizon, so your horizon stands out a little bit rather than being all blended into one. Another thing you can do, I don't want to do too much on this original, but another thing you can do if you want a little bit of that color in your lake is when the lake's dry, you can carefully wet part of it, get a little bit of that mountain color, and just gently pull it into the wet paint that you've just put there. Let's zoom in even more on that. So I want this very, very subtle, and this painting's all finished, so I don't want to do too much, but I can very subtly put a little tiny bit of that lilac in the lake, and it looks very pretty, and it looks like there might be a little bit of a reflection, although they are probably too far away to make one, but it doesn't matter. I've used that lilac in the painting. I put a little bit in the lake, and that pulls your whole painting together to have something from somewhere else reflected in the color. So he didn't do it on his, so I didn't do it on this one, but it doesn't mean to say that you can't try that. I think on dry paper, on dry paint with a little bit of wet and a tiny bit of color, looks really pretty. Probably one of your prettiest ways to do it. So 3 ways. You don't have to do one or the other, or whatever you feel like doing for a reflection. Let's zoom out a little bit more and see where we are with this. We're getting along. That gave that plenty of time to dry up a little bit, which was good. Little sidebar there. So I got 2 more mountains to fill in, and I've just thrown my reference photos to one side, which I need to look at. He's used a very gray lilac, and he probably mixed a little bit of, I think he uses raw umber quite a bit. He probably mixed a bit of raw umber with his violet to make them slightly grayer. And I went with something a little bit more brighter for mine. And again, that's a personal choice. I'm going to do a little bit more ultramarine blue. I just mixed up some very pinky violets. I put a little bit more ultramarine blue in there. And again, I want to have some wet on that mountain first. So I have a little bit of white showing. Lost my sponge. Dab some of my water off. And put a little bit of violet there. Just let it blend into the water that I put on there. And I think that's probably one thing that most people struggle with, is how to control the amount of water and amount of paint that you use. And it's so vitally important to keep your brush like just right, you don't want drips from your washing pot on there. Like, you don't want too much paint on there. It has to be carefully controlled at all times. And I think that's what people sometimes struggle with when they're trying to get the consistency of the paint just right. And I'm going to put in this last little mountain here. I did a little bit more cobalt this time to the violet. Get a little bit stronger. It's nice to have some of the mountains a bit stronger in color. And pop that one in. Now, it's not to say that you can't come back when these are dry and add a little bit more shadow if you want to. I'm going to suck. See, I've got a thirsty brush. I've washed, taken the moisture out of my brush, thirsty brush. I'm just going to suck a little bit of that color up to have a lighter part to the mountain there. And maybe a little bit of a darker edge here. Now he's come back with a few layers on these mountains to darken them up after the first layer. So you can do that too. I might do that with this one when they're perfectly dry. For now, they're okay. And we're going to work on some of the green layers. Now I would work on this far away one, move it over, this far one first, because you can, it's got less detail. So you can kind of work on your technique as you work on this one. And then when you sort of get the technique going, then you can move to the foreground one, which has a lot more detail in it. So we need to mix up. Now I can bring my green palette back. And I've still got light green, and all I need to do is add some blue or some darker green to that. I've suggested, what have I suggested? Ultramarine blue, Azo Yellow, and sap green, or ultramarine blue, Azo Yellow, and phthalo green. Now I would wait for the phthalo green until we get to the foreground for areas like this where we're putting on a really strong layer in the foreground. Of course, not phthalo green on its own, but a phthalo green mix. Whereas back here, you want a much more bluey green. Can you see how mine kind of goes from blue to green here? So if you use ultramarine blue, you get that granulation happening where you can sometimes see the blue and the yellow separating. So let's, we've got some Azo Yellow here and some sap green already. Just add a little bit more. And then let's add some ultramarine to that to darken it up a little bit. And to this one, I'm going to add some cobalt to darken it up a bit. So I have a couple of mixes there. And I'm going to start with this one here, just adding in that background shading. So I'm actually going to wet just here in case I don't want it full strength. And I want to get the one that has a little bit more ultramarine blue in it. And this is where I'm going to get a little bit more careful with my edges of my hills. So I'm going to start from the edge here, the ultramarine blue, Azo Yellow, sap green mix. And I'm actually going to get some Azo Yellow over here on its own. So if I want to modify the mix with some Azo Yellow, I can. A little bit of Azo Yellow to modify that mix. Just pop it here. See? Wipe off my brush and pull those two just down. Now you don't have to have fussy edges for this. Ronald Maddox has got lots of hard edges and washes showing. It's his style, and that's what I'm trying to emulate here, is his kind of loose style. So I'm not going fussy. What I did was, with the part that was ultramarine, met the water, and then I added a little Azo Yellow. So I've got lots of things happening with this wash here. I don't want to go right next to it at the moment. I want to come forward here a little bit, and I will use my number 6 brush, and I'm going to use the one that I made with the Cobalt Blue. I'm going to put this wash in a little bit more flat than that one I just did. And I'm going to also pick up a little bit of that ultramarine blue wash as I go along. Bring that one over. Wash my brush, get the water off on my disgusting sponge here, and use that, what I call a damp brush, just slightly wet, to pull that wash out and over here, so we don't have the same strength. We've got full strength over here coming along and fading, pulled in with that damp brush over here. In front of this, I want to have a more yellowy wash in a moment so that it pulls forward a little bit from that. We have to be very careful how we work each area. I think we can do this area here. Add a little bit more yellow to my, see, what I've got now is I've got this palette full of yellows and blues and greens, so I can modify each one a little bit. I'm going to take more yellow into that ultramarine wash and just pop it in here. Now it is quite abstract, these little hill shapes. It's not until you get them all in and a few details that they all kind of pull together. And what we need, of course, is we need a little bit in here when that other part's dry. And this part I think is dry enough. I'm going to add a little bit more sap green to this hill. I'm going to go into my sap green again. Now I've got this huge tray of greens. I'm going to grab some sap green and pop it over here. So I've got a few to go to and pop that here. Now I hardly touched, barely touched this area where I had that wet paint. So I'm like 1 millimeter away from the wet paint. You can barely see that. And I'm going to add some ultramarine blue to that sap green. And as I come down to this point here, I've added a little bit of ultramarine blue to the sap green to darken it as it comes down here. Why? Because he's got trees and detail, and kind of putting it all in at once. Here's pop up a few little trees here. He's got some little trees along the shoreline. I'm putting those in very abstracty as I go along. Now it probably looks a bit weird at the moment. We've still got this to go in and this to go in and a few trees, but I want that to dry before I do those. So I'm going to move over to this one over here and add a little bit more cobalt because it's further away, and a little bit more water. And I can go in with that more cobalty green and a bit more water back here. Actually going to take my brush and suck a little bit of that color off, just so it's not quite so strong. And remember that white here, we're going to kind of do a shaded mountain there. Get my little tiny number 2 brush, which has disappeared on me. Where did you go, brush? I don't know. It's decided to go for a walk. So we use my number 4 brush and some sap green with a little bit of ultramarine blue in it. I know you can't see my palette all of the time, but I'm adding a little bit down here. A little bit more sap green. And down here, I'm going to just put some little trees down here, really tiny. Maybe over here. Really small. Oh, I just found my number 2 brush there. But I decided to go live on my camera, which has a black base, so my black brush just disappeared. Right, so this hill next to that one is not going to touch hardly any wet paint. So I'm going to get a slightly yellower green, mix a bit more Azo Yellow in with that sap green, and put this hill on. And he does not have a clean edge to that. I'm just going to take a little bit of water to blend it in just a little bit. You just kind of, you don't always see, you know, he doesn't always have a clean edge. It's sometimes just a wet edge. It's sometimes just a blob. Might have even gone a bit too strong with that. Might take a bit off. See why we mixed all those greens? And even so, I'm not using all that many of them, but I am trying to vary them. So I have some bluey greens, some yellowy greens, and eventually we'll have some much darker greens. And there's that over here. Right, so I don't want to go right next to that wet hillside. So I'll change to my number 4 brush and move forward to this hillside here. Use my sap green with cobalt. And we're going to do this hill here. Remember, you don't have to be perfect. We're going for a little bit more of an abstract look to this. And I'm going to add a little bit of yellowy green in here, and I don't mind if they blend wet in wet, because like I said, we're not going for perfect. I want the kind of blending to happen just there with that little bit of yellow green. And I want them to blend wet in wet.
I'm just taking that brush, things with that mock leash place to run around.
Right, let's see where we are, what we can work on. We can definitely work on this foreground one. It's in a nice dry spot, and I want it to be nice and bright and plenty of yellow. So sap green with Azo Yellow. Because it's in the foreground, you want things brighter, warmer, stronger in the foreground. And number 8 brush, because we don't want to be too fiddly with the brush strokes. And I want to put that nice, oh, I've got water splats here. I'm going to put this lovely bright yellowy green here. Kind of just take it up like this. And wet in wet, I'm going to work a slightly bluer sap green with cobalt blue, a bit more sap green, and a bit of, needs a bit of yellow in it. And just a slightly bluer one, just wet in wet, right up against it there. So that I have the bluer green mixing with that yellowy green, wet in wet, and making that more a stronger, warmer color for the foreground. We can go over here with a very similar green. Actually, you know what? I think I'm going to go here with, I'm going to water down the yellowy sap green, just put a bit more color here. What I want to wait here for is to add a little bit of the phthalo green to that one, make it much, much stronger. The key is to have these kind of rolling, these are all rolling hills. So have that kind of roll to your brush stroke, where you kind of roll your brush stroke and make those rolling hills. And sometimes it doesn't matter if you work wet in wet and they blend, because then you get that lovely watercolor look to them. Right, this one back here, let's move this over a little bit. This one back here is starting to dry. So I want to put a bit more bluey green back here. Go to the one with cobalt. And more water so that it's not as strong. And we're going to put in this one back here. And you can add, I'm going to get a little bit of ultramarine. It's got a whole sloosh of it. A little bit of ultramarine on my brush, and I'm going to charge that into the tip of that hill. And just pull that in with the tip of my brush. So I've got a little bit of blue coming down the top of that hill. And the foreground one, I have this more yellowy green on here. I'm going to put a bit of yellowy green in the foreground one, just to slice across like that. I will be putting a few more trees on there. Sort of work back and forth between the different hills. I have to see what's working. Got another big blob of green on my mountains over here. Let's get that off. Right. So let's be bold and let's mix up a green that has the phthalo in it to get a much stronger green here. And for some of the greenery, we don't want pure phthalo green. That's going to be much too strong. So over here, let's start with some Azo Yellow. And what else did I had to read my recommendations. Ultramarine Blue and Phthalo Green. So some Ultramarine Blue. Plenty of yellow, so it's still a nice bright green, and some Phthalo Green. A bit more Ultramarine Blue. So we want something that's quite a bit stronger. I'm taking it down a bit with Ultramarine Blue. I don't want it too phthalo-y. Otherwise it's not going to work with this painting at all if it's going to be too phthalo blue, green. There we go. Might need a bit more. Just pop that on there, and I think I might need a bit more yellow. How's that? Let's give that a go. Using the point of my brush to go down into this hill here, come up, and I actually want to wet the bottom of this. I'm going to take some of that very yellowy green on my brush and wet the bottom of that phthalo green with that yellowy green and just let it blend wet in wet. And even here. Each time you have to kind of stop and think, what effect are you wanting to go for? What are you trying to achieve? A little bit of that phthalo green. And maybe add a little bit over here, just a bit of strength to that hill. And again, once these layers are dry, you can add a little bit more to everything to give it more interest. I'm having a little think about what to do next, about whether this is dry enough. And I want to have that sap green, mostly sap green there. Sap green's a pretty color. Use it. It's a nice spring color. Let's pop it here. Use a wet brush to just soften it in a little bit. I'm also going to take a little bit of that sap green here, pull that in, and maybe to pull it all together, just a little bit there. You don't have to connect them all. You can sort of have them rolling here, rolling there, and some of them wet in wet, some of them not. And then you can pull them all together later with a few brush strokes and a few trees and a little bit of grass. Now, mine's reached a stage now where I really do need to dry it before I do too much more to it. But one thing I could do before I go and dry, all of this is pretty dry over here. I'm going to add the little red sailboat. You can use cadmium red, permanent red, pretty strong on a tiny brush. And I'm just going to pop that in, just because it's something I can do while letting the other colors soak in. Kind of nice with all of this green that we've got on here to have one little complementary red sailboat. I think 2 or 3 would be too much. That's why he has done just one, and then 2 little white ones, and that's why I think that's a very good idea. There's just one little red boat. 2. I've got my Dr. P.H. Martin's bleed proof white, my tiny brush, and I'm just going to put those little white sailboats into, because I'm finished with the lake and the lake color. And I can pop those in when I'm waiting for the green to soak in. And of course, when we're finished all of the green, you can also, if you want to, put in some like little dotted sheep on the hillside, or some details like that if you want to. If you didn't get enough sparkles on your lake, you could also drag your brush across the lake with your Dr. P.H. Martin's white and put a few sparkles in. That's always an option too. I'll just put those little white sailboats in. I might put another layer when they're dry. I will tell you what I need to do. I need to just put a bit of a hull under the, I'll put a white hull under the sail. You don't need much detail there in the distance. He's just on little triangles. And over here, this is fairly dry. I also want to put a bit of just cobalt blue, just cobalt blue by itself. I want to put a little bit of blue shadow on that white hill, just down in the valley, a little bit of blue shadow. A little bit of blue shadow on this one. Over here. And I think we get some ultramarine blue. I think I want to just darken the tip of this one a little bit. Just got some ultramarine blue on my brush. I'm not going to take the blue all the way down. It's just going to go on the top to darken the top. With my slightly wet brush, I'm going to pick up some of that blue and smush it in down here, just so that one stands out a little bit from the other one. And that's something you can do as you work on your mountains. If you want to get a bit more definition or detail, you can go back and put in a little bit of blue or lilac, or even a greeny gray if you want to have a little bit more definition. Don't put too much because they're in the distance and you don't want to pull them forward by adding way too much detail. A little bit of shadow on that one. That's enough for now. Right, I'm going to pause again, mute, because I want to get my hills really dry so that I can sort of work on my final layers with the hills. So one thing I noticed I have left out is a little bit of shoreline just here. So I'm going to use my white paint to put that back in. I noticed that Ronald Maddox has a little bit of like almost, I think, like beach here, just coming around here. Kind of makes a nice edge to that. He also has a few sheep on this hillside over here, and I'm just hoping that some little dots with my P.H. Martin's white. This might look like sheep over there in the distance, who knows? I'll go back over those sailboats a bit more white. And also, if you wanted a bit more white on your mountains, if you thought, oh, I needed a little bit more, you can also do a little bit of dry brush white on the mountains too, if you want to. If that's something that you feel you would like. I love this white paint. What I do want to do is on this shore is have a few little trees. His were extremely loose, sort of blobbed trees here and there, but very effective. I made mine a little bit more tree shaped, but it's probably no need for me to. So I want to go into one of my darker greens, one with the phthalo green and the ultramarine blue, a little bit of sap green maybe, a little tiny brush. And I already put a few little trees over here, but I can add a few more here and there. And the key is to not be too fussy. You just sort of wiggle your brush a little bit until you get a sort of a tree shape. Put some close together and some further apart so that you're not putting them like little soldiers all standing up to attention, same in a row. Some are taller and then a few here. And he has a few in the background. Oh, I want to go to a much lighter green for that one that's not quite so strong. And we can put some trees up here, a few over here maybe. It just gives a little bit of something happening in the background. If you feel that you haven't got enough in the way of hills happening, whoops, you can also, you can add a little bit more if you want to, if you feel like, oh, I need a bit more of a hill back here, maybe a bluer hill and back there. Maybe I need to make that a little bit better. Or you might think, oh, I just need a bit more shadow here, a bit more definition, maybe just a little bit. Don't overdo it, but you can add a little bit of detail. The place we're going to add quite a bit more, of course, is over here on the foreground. And we're going to want to go quite dark now with our greens so that we have more definition, more intensity in the foreground. I think my brush, I think a number 6 will do me. And then add a little bit more sap green, a little bit more ultramarine blue. It's a bit stronger green here. And then make this a bit stronger here. So we've got, and wet it in, maybe wet it in with a bit more yellowy green. So it's not quite so in your face. And a little bit more sap green, a bit more cobalt, and put some hills in over here. And bluey green back here. And a wet brush is always helpful to kind of like blend some of the edges. Take a little bit of that darker green, go down in the valley of this one. I'm going to take a wet brush, put it across the top, because that will pull it up into sort of almost like grass shapes. We are going to add a few grass shapes. And this hill here is a bit too light. Go to a bigger brush again and sap green with some Azo Yellow. And get a little bit more color onto this one here. That was sap green and Azo Yellow to give a bright hillside there, maybe a little bit here. And a bit of water. Now there's a few other things he's put in there. He's put some little trees. So very tiny brush, little number 2 brush. And his trees sort of look like pine trees. And as it's Scotland, I think they probably are supposed to be pine trees. So I'm going to do I'm going to put brown on the tree trunk later. I'm going to start it with green to start with and have a little bit of movement to these trees. They're kind of, and zoom in for you. They're kind of like they're blowing in the breeze or in quite a strong wind, actually. The sailing boats are out there. So I'm going to make mine sort of, they're going off to the side a bit. They're blowing. There's 3 of them. I'll pop those in like that. Now what I'm going to do to get the darker browns and things is add some sepia or any dark brown that you have to the green. I don't want it to be just brown. I think he adds burnt umber to his greens to make the browns. I think that's what he said. I'm going to add that. I use sepia to the green, and I'm going to use that now for the trunk. Just put it in. I'm also going to use that wet in wet here with this wet paint to suggest like gorse or something here. And also right here with this paint, wet in wet, suggest a little bit of something in the undergrowth here. And I'm following, I'm following what he's got here. He's definitely got sort of wet in wet. I think burnt umber and green here for some of these hillsides that would have grasses and gorses and different things. And it works really well wet and wet, especially if your wet paint is starting to dry, so it can kind of blend in a bit more softly. Now he does have some grasses that are much more defined, so we have to put those in when this is a bit more dry. I'll probably use my rigger brush. I feel this was a little bit too dry here, so I'm going to get some green paint and just soften that in a bit. Some more yellowy sort of paint and put a bit of an edge here and poke up some grass. And we're almost finished. The only things we really need to do, zoom out a little bit, is use a very thin brush, a rigger brush, or some kind of a brush like that to just pull up a little bit of grass by my rigger. And I would, for yours, I would dry yours before you do that, before you do this, just in interest of saving a bit of time. I'm not going to dry. I'm just going to use my rigger, and I want my grass to be blowing in the same direction as my sailboats, in the same direction as that tree, which is sort of blowing to the right. So I'm going to pull some grasses up here, sort of blowing off to the right of the painting, and a few here. Not too many. If you do too many, it's going to be a bit fiddly looking. Just a few, because this is your foreground and you want to have something happening here. So just a few wisps of long grass, just blowing in the wind. Let's see how many he has. He's put a few back here too. And he's got a little bit darker than, because he's got all those sheep hanging around. And a little bit more of that dark brown on the tree. Can add a dark brown side to it as it's drying. A bit of shadow on this hill maybe. And we're just about done. And actually, it works okay doing it on slightly wet paint, because some of it is showing up dry where it's on the dry lake, and then the rest is nice and soft looking. Definitely like pull up and flick with your brush so that you get some gentle strokes. I do think that just wondering if I need a little bit more shadow in the dip of that hillside, just there, a little bit. And it's really important not to kind of overdo it. You need to be careful that you stop before you flick too much grass around or put too much shadow on or too many layers. Let's just zoom out a little bit from there to the full painting. So for me, that's pretty much finished, I think. Actually, what I am feeling is this shore over here, where I put a bit of water on the shore, is a little bit light, probably a little bit lighter than I would like it. So I think I'm going to take some cerulean blue and some cobalt blue, and I'm going to go for another layer just here on the far shore and put in a bit more color. A few streaks. I've got paper in my hand, looking at my, let's put in a few more streaks of color there. And if I wanted, just like we did on the other one, just pulling a little bit of that smaller brush, number 2 brush, a little bit of that violet. And I kind of liked that look where we had just a little bit of that violet from the mountains, just put in there gently and just smushed in a little bit with a wet brush. A little bit of ultramarine, and just again, just darken up that shoreline just a little bit, so it's not so light. I think that is enough detail in a small painting like that. And, we have tried to emulate Ronald Maddox and his beautiful Loch Tay. He did some beautiful paintings, so many of them, and they're really worth a look. I know I sent you some of his pictures, and I thought they were lovely. Oh, let's. Well, thank you for joining me for another Watercolours with Caroline, Art Around the World. Today we were in Scotland, and don't forget we were copying a painting by Ronald Maddox, and just for practice, so we could try and learn his way of painting. Not something we should sell or share publicly. Very public here on YouTube, but you know what I mean. This is for our own practice and for our own learning. So thank you for joining me. Happy painting, and please let me know how your paintings turned out, and bye for now.